Welcome to Conduct of Life, our second class. And as we hinted at last week, we will begin our discussion this semester with a contrasted example. Throughout this semester, we will be asking us to rethink our most fundamental assumptions about ourselves, the world around us, and how we can live properly within this world, how we can change ourselves to do so, and how we can transform the world to make that possible for all of us to do so. Those will be the themes and larger concerns of this class. We thought it might be helpful to begin with the contrast we hinted at. In that contrast, we will be looking at today, we'll be talking about the dominant, by far, ways in which these issues are discussed in current academic theories of ethics. We will look at Derek Parfit's attempt in On What Matters to finally synthesize the major three positions that have dominated this conversation for 2 centuries in academic philosophical departments, therefore coming up, he argues, with clearly the correct solution because it brings together all of the great powers of all 3 positions, and by bringing them together, clearly shows them to be accurate. So, to introduce this, let me say a few quick words about these 3 positions, a few quick words about Parfit's attempts to bring them together, and raise a few, to put it mildly, concerns about the project. However, to begin, since many of you may not have read these works before, let me say a few quick words about these 3 positions to show you what it is that Parfit is attempting to do. So, the 3 dominant positions in academic philosophical discussions of ethics are Kantianism, consequentialism, and contractualism. Very briefly, Kantianism, and here I'll phrase them prior to the ways that Parfit is going to try to rework them. For Kantianism, the position is, I, as a rational individual, should never act in a way that I could not make into a universalizable maxim for absolutely everyone to follow. So in every situation, I should do only what is universalizable. He himself even brings up an example that Parfit touches on to show the degree to which you must do this in every situation. So one of Kant's own examples is, imagine you're sitting at home and an innocent person knocks on your door and says, there's an evil murderer who's trying to kill me, can I hide in your house? And you say, of course, you're innocent, hide in my house. Then the evil murderer knocks on your door and says, well, is that innocent person that I'm trying to kill hiding in your house? Should you lie or not? Kant's famous answer is, well, no, because you cannot universalize that humans should lie, and therefore you must tell the truth. And then he says, this is really true. Then he literally says, but hopefully while you're telling the truth, the innocent person will sneak out the back window before the murderer can come in and kill him. He literally says that. And Kant's point here is to say, we will tend in certain situations to let these universalizable maxims fall, but we shouldn't. We should always follow them, come what may, because we cannot alter our maxims by the situation. So there are those who have found this a somewhat uncomfortable position and have argued on the contrary, and this is the second group called the consequentialists, that on the contrary, we should determine ethical decision-making based upon the consequences of our actions. So, in this case, not surprisingly, since the consequence of our actions, minus the slight chance the person might sneak out the back window, since in all likelihood, the consequence of our telling the truth in that situation will be that the innocent man will be murdered by the evil murderer, we should, weighing consequences, tell a lie, because telling a lie is a minor offense given the gravity of the innocent person being murdered. So, in that instance, we should focus on the consequences. And more broadly, in order for a consequentialist position to work, even in that example, as you're seeing, you have to do a cost-benefit analysis. In this example, my lying is a lesser cost to the greater benefit of saving the innocent person. However, if you're working this out for larger issues, you need to find a way to quantify all of these consequences to make the rational decision-making process work. The most common, by far, consequentialist position is a utilitarian ethic that will basically say you weigh the costs and benefits of everything you do, or societally speaking, you weigh the costs and benefits of social policies, and those costs and benefits, since they're quantifiable, will tell you what to do. So much of economic theory, for example, in the Western world is based upon a generally consequentialist perspective. It's all about quantifiable costs and benefits, and then you determine social policy accordingly. The third one is a contractualist position. The contractualist position basically holds that what is right is what rational individuals through rational adjudication decide is correct. So that may or may not in certain moments take a consequentialist position, but that will be up to the rational decision-making process. For those in this camp, obviously the big question is, how do you determine that rational adjudication process? So for example, do you do it under democratic norms? If so, is it an absolute majoritarian rule? Do you give minority groups who would never gain a majority vote extra voting power? So all the debates are, how do you assure that the rational adjudication process really can operate? So very briefly, these are the three positions. And in 2 centuries of debates, the way these debates will play out is, well, first, you've already gotten hints of this from my very, very brief descriptions. Each will often choose examples that seem to fit well, with the minus example of Kant, who at least to his credit chooses the most absurd example that would seem to be devastating, but nonetheless, his one moment of greatness there is he's least honest about it. Usually, however, they will choose examples that seem to work well for them, and more importantly, all three share the same assumption, which is to make the arguments, you cut out all of the larger issues about social context, about the complexity of human relations, about the historical background leading to that complexity. You assume a world of purely rational individuals simply debating about a single decision, again, minus all of the context, which in the examples are always taken out, and then argue which is right. So last week we mentioned very briefly the famous example of, okay, you're in a life raft, there are 4 of you, there's enough food for 3 people, what do you do? And then the 3 positions will argue it out. Well, if you take the Kantian position, you can't throw someone overboard because it's never universalizable to throw someone overboard into the ocean so they'll drown. And so you just eat the 3 amounts of food, all 4 of you, and hope the ship comes in, just as you're hoping the innocent person will escape out the back window. The consequentialist position, of course, would say, no, you do a cost-benefit analysis. And here it's usually, okay, well, the first one is the easy one. If there's food for 3 and there are 4 of us, 1 gets thrown overboard because it's better benefit if 3 of us survive than risking all 4 dying. And then you decide, how do you quantify who should get thrown over? And then the question is, how do you quantify the costs and benefits of who gets tossed? For the contractualist position, of course, it's the 4 people should rationally adjudicate what to do. And since they probably won't come up with the same answer, then that gets you into all the issues of who gets the vote and how do we determine that? Do you simply do it a majoritarian rule, so 3 people decide, and then you get sort of the typical kinds of works of who's going to join with who to say, okay, if we throw that person over, will you join my group? Or if we throw that person over and then that all works out, and you take the vote, and then the losing end person gets thrown over. As we mentioned last week, when all 3 play this game, they all 3 are doing the exact same thing, which is, again, to create an absurdly artificial situation that you will never be in with absurdly predefined aspects of conditions to make the decision-making the only issue at hand. So 4 people, 3 amounts of food. Huh? That's absurd, but that's the point. You create that world, it's 4 rational individuals, and then you debate what to do, taking out, again, everything else. How do people live their lives? What is the social world within which they are living? All of the complexities that would play into this. Also, assuming the fact that I would say is almost assuredly not going to be the case, which is that all ethical decisions should be thought of as decisions and choices. One of the things we will see, in fact, all of the decisions we'll be exploring in this class would say, what humans do usually, and I'll say this is a bad thing that we have to break, and they'll debate as to how to break it, but what humans basically do is we fall into habits and conventions of behavior that basically determines all of what we do. And most of what we even call a decision and a choice is ex post facto. We just sort of do what we do, and later we say, well, I decided X. No, you probably just did X. And you're never going to be in a life raft with 4 people and 3 amounts of food. But in any situation you are in, very difficult, you probably are not going to be making rational decisions on any of these 3. So the whole exercise is artificial. It creates a world of rational individuals deciding amongst themselves what to properly do. It cuts out everything that actually exists in the world. And it always poses a particular problem that you're going to decide rationally how to act within. All share the exact same set of assumptions, which finally brings us to Derek Parfit. So Derek Parfit recently passed away, but was one of the leading philosophers coming out of this tradition. And as you have seen in your readings, he saw as his philosophical project to bring all 3 of these together, arguing that all 3 are simply climbing up different sides of the same mountain, and once we can play with the specific wording of each of the 3, we can see that they are saying the same thing, and that will prove that we've come up with, once he's pulled it off, the correct ethical position, because basically everyone of the past 2 centuries who's been debating this is proven right once you tweak their wordings a little bit. So very briefly, the move is basically to say, okay, you begin with Kant, but you take out the maxim part and say it should be what you could do, what you could universalize someone to do in that situation. So obviously Kant would be very unhappy with this, but once you've done that, then you can turn to the consequentialist position and say, and then you can work that in because it's what anyone would do in the situation if they took into account the key consequences. And then you bring in the contractualist and say, okay, it's what you can do in this situation that's universalizable, taking into account the consequences in a way that would bring everyone else on board too, so they would agree that these are the key consequences that should be universalizable in this situation. And we've given you just a little excerpt where he is summarizing the argument. Were you to read the whole argument, it is a 3-volume work where what I just laid out in 30 seconds is played out over, 1,500 pages, working out all the little nuances by which this would occur. Concluding, of course, with what he truly feels to be the final solution to this ethical debate. Needless to say, by the way we've set this up, we're a little unconvinced, and let us now raise a few, to put it politely, questions not only about that enterprise, but rather what the enterprise shows about the dangers of this entire approach to ethical decisions. If again, decisions is even the proper word. So, note what Parfit has not done. He has not questioned any of the assumptions. In fact, quite the contrary of these 3. He fully takes on board all of the assumptions we've just mentioned, accepts them completely, simply tweaking them to make them seem to be saying the same thing, in his opinion, solving all of the great world's problems, but you can easily twist it around and say, contrary to his own goals, what he has very brilliantly and stunningly shown is the fact that all 3 really are saying the same thing. And far from proving them to be right, it shows they're just basically arguing the same position with the most minor issues of variation, which in practice have relatively little impact because you can play the game of Derek Parfit and endlessly rework them so they're basically saying the same thing, proving, one would think, the opposite of what Parfit wants to claim, which is that it shows the absurdity of the entire enterprise. If you raise any of the questions that we will be posing throughout this semester, what constitutes human life? How do humans interact, contrary to the ways we often think we are interacting? What would it mean to take that self-consciously into consideration were we to want to maintain the possibility of radically transforming ourselves and the world around us? Were we to do that, would we come up with artificial scenarios? Would we assume all individuals are rationally adjudicating actors? Would we assume that all so-called ethical decisions are in fact decisions? The answer very quickly, I think, is clearly no. Even the claim that we are all rational individuals presupposes an entire vision of humanity that should be questioned very, very strongly in terms of what that means, what we mean by rationality, how we even define an individual, creating these artificial scenarios where all of these limited numbers of rational individuals are on a completely equal ground, rationally adjudicating, forgetting all of the complex social worlds that create hierarchies, discriminations, ways and modes of interacting that would undermine all of that. And again, assuming that ethical questions come down to choices and decisions when, minus an extraordinary amount of work, only in these rarefied artificial scenarios is that even going to be the case. So we have started with this work as a contrastive example. It is a good example of the state of the field of current academic philosophizing about ethics, the position that we will spend most of this semester not only working against, but trying to completely undermine and rethink as an entire enterprise as we try explicitly to turn to the very questions that the entire work of Parfit and the 2 centuries of work that he is building upon take as their goal to wipe out of the equation in order to make their arguments. So we hope you have found it, if not an exciting reading, at least a helpful reading to think through. If you were not feeling, by the end of this minor excerpt, that you had seen a great thinker solve all the problems of the world, but rather saw perhaps a great thinker against his own intentions showing the limitations of the entire approach, then hopefully it has been a helpful exercise because it will allow us to pose the next set of questions. What is it, therefore, that we need to do differently to begin to address what the entire project that Parfit is involved in takes for granted that we should cut out of the equation?
So maybe we should first
Let's
ask
open it
whether
up.
someone
Yes.
wants to make a comment or ask a question.
And anything goes. So grand questions about what we're doing, but if you have even specific questions about these 3 positions, how they're working, what Parfit is up to, so as always throughout this course, feel free to move from grand to straightforward. Yes, please.
In responding to Parfit, are you also going to address perhaps the fact that there are limits to human reason, either collective or individual?
Absolutely. And the way you put it is beautiful. I mean, this assumes, the entire approach assumes that, yes, human reason can solve everything. And I suspect all of us would agree that that is an absurd position, but I think the reason it doesn't seem absurd when you're reading Parfit, especially the full 3-volume work, is exactly what underlies your question. The whole working creates these artificial scenarios where human reason does seem to solve everything. So in that life raft, okay, well, I mean, actually, it wouldn't solve anything, but you can imagine an artificial scenario where it sounds like it's solving things. And that's the key ways that these work. It sounds like, okay, if we can decide how these rational individuals should adjudicate this one decision, they'll have solved the problem. And the only way you can do that is by creating these artificial scenarios where something we would like to call human reason seems to solve that specific problem. And when in human life is that ever the case? Ever the case. So I think you're exactly right. It cuts out everything that makes us tick, both for good and bad, as human beings. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, please.
How do you feel that the idea of virtue ethics fits
Yes.
into the whole picture?
Oh, yes. So virtue ethics is basically an attempt to actually question a lot of this, although not as fully as we will be going into this class. So virtue ethics is basically an argument that On the contrary, instead of assuming rational individuals rationally adjudicating a particular decision, what you should focus on in contrast is the development of the individual to become virtuous, to be able to sense a situation correctly. So the position, that this came up very briefly last week, is articulated by Aristotle, and his position is it's all about gaining proper habits that will allow you to become a virtuous individual such that you, in a situation, can accurately make a decision about what is right, and it's the work going into it that matters rather than the final decision making that you then articulate a specific ground for making, whether that be consequentialist, contractualist, or Kantian. Now, that being said, the key is how you define all of this. So when virtue ethics was brought into this conversation, so it was literally a 20th century attempt to bring Aristotle into this debate, the, I would say, unfortunate way that that occurred was not in the potentially radical form that it could have been done, but rather as kind of another variation of this, basically saying, okay, we need to work on training the individual to reach that point where they could accurately make this decision. Now, I think that's a step forward, but insofar as you're stopping there, and I don't mean to imply Aristotle necessarily was, but certainly the 20th century appropriation of Aristotle, I think, is in danger of this, you're still not posing the larger questions. So, what is virtue? How does the training happen? Who has access to the training? What does the training even imply? If, and this actually is true for Aristotle, you're thinking of training as being only available for an incredibly limited number of people who are hereditarily capable of it, Aristotle says this literally in so many words, then there are extraordinary problems, needless to say, and moreover, Aristotle isn't giving you anything in the definition of virtue ethics that would allow you to question any of that, and in the 20th century appropriation of it, that sadly continues. So a virtue ethics would only work if it were a virtue ethics that goes beyond simply the limited way it's been explored, where you would question all of that. Who can do this? What does training mean? What does virtue mean? And how would this be even attempted? I'm saying all of this in a way that's hinting towards some things we'll be getting to in about 6 or 7 weeks. We'll be discussing the Confucian position, which in some ways is a variation of virtue ethics, and yet it's a virtue ethics that's intrinsically concerned with exactly these questions that tend to be taken out in the 20th century appropriation of Aristotle. So wonderful question. We'll be coming back to it explicitly in about 6 weeks. And there was another question, I think, about, yes, please.
I was wondering, would you say that contractualism is just kind of a middle ground between Kantianism and consequentialism? It's kind of like, you know, saying you do a mix of both of these things. And I feel like, I don't know if it's somewhat of a circular argument, because you're saying contractualism is whatever rational individuals decide is correct, but obviously in retrospect, you can then say, oh, however people decide this is however it is correct, and you just kind of go around that. Aren't we just already living in contractualism, which whatever you're doing right now is what we do by custom, is what we decide, if you were to call this rational.
Right, precisely. And I think that's exactly right. So first, the way contractualists will claim it's working, and then I'll get back to why I think your characterization of it is absolutely correct. So what contractualists will claim they are doing is bringing in a rational adjudication process to this. So if you take the consequentialist position to its extreme, say in terms of social policy, what it would mean would be economists who can make social policy decisions based upon a pure cost-benefit analysis because they can do the cost-benefit analysis and the rest of us can't. So there's a strong anti-democratic push to consequentialist positions. So the contractualist claim is we are bringing an adjudication process wherein people can rationally adjudicate what, to stick with that example, a given social policy would be. So their claim is that that would be a rational adjudication process comparable to what we think of as democratic norms in which people will decide for themselves what to do. That being said, I think your critique is very convincing, and I'll stick with the same example to underline the point. I think it is quite clear. We are living in a self-proclaimed democratic state at the moment in the United States of America. I don't think any of us in this room would argue that, in fact, it operates as a world where all of us are given an equal voice to rationally adjudicate social policy decisions. And all of our frustrations with that come down to precisely the points you're bringing to the table. What often defines all of these issues are precisely the issues that are cut out from a contractualist mode of argumentation. So, very concretely, how is voting even being defined? What are possible topics for voting that are even votable? So a yes, no on what? Who decides that? How is who, not only who gets a vote, but in what ways are those votes counted and how do they matter? To what degree are votes really based upon a decision or choice model at all? Are they not, as you said, often based upon habits that people fall into that are often very manipulatable by, to give a not random example, advertising, the current work being done with algorithms, meaning that in practice we live in a much more consequentialist world than the contractualist world we would like to claim we live in. So they would say, no, it's really a radically separate position because we allow that rational adjudication to occur. I think you're exactly right. It plays into precisely the same dangers as the other two positions. Yeah, thank you.
Right.
Oh, and yes, one more question, please.
Yeah, sorry. I was wondering, is there any sense in which all of these are sort of working backwards? Like, it seems like, unlike math and science, where you take first principles and you use them to derive some rule, here we're like guessing and checking rules based on our own intuition and, deciding whether the rule is right, like whether Kant's rule is right about letting the murderer in based on whether we implicitly think it's right to let the murderer in. I was just wondering, do any of these claims be based on some more universal principle?
Very well put. And I'll begin with the last point. They all claim they are. So absolutely, all of them claim to be giving absolutely universalizable principles with absolute grounds that could and should be used to make all decisions whatsoever. And the way they do it, they would claim, is a first principled argument where you take things down to the basic level, rational individuals. Sorry for my absurd tone of voice, but this is their claim anyway. Rational individuals that would then have clear norms for following, be those Kantian, consequentialists, or contractualists, that would allow them, those rational individuals, to solve everything. That being said, I think the first part of your question sets this up completely and very, very effectively. No, what they are really doing is, obviously these theories arise at a certain moment. They arise in Europe, beginning in the 18th century, but much more dominantly in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is a world where that claim of rational individuals, namely sort of white male bourgeois figures, the claim was that the middle class should be given power, they should be defined as these rational individuals, and they should be making decisions as opposed to the world of the 18th century and before, where everything in Europe was defined by heredity and birth. And so this was an attempt to say, we're going to radically transform the world by defining everything in terms of rational individuals. I put it that way to emphasize, as we'll be getting to very, very quickly, they are playing off of one of the two positions that we'll be looking at in detail in this course, but it is undermining everything that will animate that tradition. So some of the terminology sounds a little bit like the claim of individuals transforming themselves and the world around them through radical attempts at self-fashioning. That is not what these figures are talking about. It's taking for granted all individuals are already rational. If they're not already, they shouldn't be part of this discussion. And those who are part of this discussion can only debate these incredibly predefined issues with incredibly predefined norms in these absurdly artificial situations. So it arises at a certain time. They would claim they're talking about first principles. I think on the contrary, they're assuming a world that is um, incredibly limiting, to put it mildly, does not at all live up to what they claim that world to be. And we'll spend the rest of the semester discussing counter views as to what it would really mean to question everything that they are taking for granted as the grounds for making their first principled argument. So yeah, I think you've laid out what they're claimed to be doing and the dangers very effectively.
So I am going to make 4 sets of remarks. I'm going to proceed in 4 steps. First, I want to make some general remarks about the point of departure of this approach to ethics that we're calling the school philosophy. Second, I want to say something about each of the 3 positions. Third, I want to examine the substance of the Parfit thesis and deal with the problem of the supposed equivalence of these 3 positions. And finally, in the 4th step, I want to place this approach to ethics in an elementary historical setting. So, first the approach. So this is the approach to ethics that prevails, Michael said, in academic philosophy, but I think it would be more precise to say in English-speaking academic philosophy. And we call it the school philosophy because this is how ethics is taught in schools. And it has 2 parts. One part is a meta-ethics that explores what is the correct method, what is the conceptual contraption by which to determine our obligations to one another. And the second part is moral casuistry. So those are these fictitious problems, these imaginary problems about the train, the boat, and so forth. That's the approach to ethics that prevails in the English-speaking countries. Now, just a few words about the point of departure. First, it is a meta-ethics rather than a first-order ethics. It has implications for how to live, what we owe one another, but its first concern is methodological. What is the correct method by which to determine what we should do and what our obligations are? Now, second, it is focused on the specification of our obligations to one another. The French philosopher Henri Bergson distinguished a morality of aspiration and a morality of obligation. And these views, as they are approached in the school philosophy, are definitely on the side of the morality of obligation rather than the morality of aspiration. The 2 ethical positions that we will mainly explore in this course are both really ethics of aspiration, of our ascent to a higher form of life, although each of them has implications for what we owe one another. And third, they all present as their central idea the perspective of a universalistic altruism. That is, the perspective is how can we create a form of moral discourse in which the individual is not at the center of his own world. Everyone is treated the same. We're impartial among individuals. We're impartial in relation to the perspective of the ego. Now then, it's not obvious that this should be the point of departure of ethics. That's the first thing to say. Let me give you another example of a way of thinking, which will have some relevance to our discussion subsequently in the course. You could say, the fundamental problem in ethics is not what we owe one another. The fundamental problem is how can we be reconciled to one another, to society, and to ourselves. And how is it that through this reconciliation we can come more fully into the possession of life. So, how do we become a person? We have to connect to other people. So the first problem is the relation of the self to others. But every connection threatens us with some form of subjugation or loss of personal identity. How can we connect without being subjugated? And that problem will then have both a moral response and a political response. To the extent that the political response fails, the moral response becomes all the more important. Because in some sense, our ethical ideas have to make up for the failures of politics. Now then, the second problem is, and we are free only to the extent that we can connect without being subjugated. So there's a tension in the enabling conditions of our personality, of self-construction, that we need the others, but the others are also the enemy. They place us in jeopardy. And only to the extent that we attenuate that tension are we free. Then we have a problem of the relation of the self to the social order. No one can be free if he's marginalized, if he's outside the social world. To be free, we have to engage in a social world. But if the social world exacts as the price for our engagement our surrender to it, we are not free. So there's a second tension. It's a tension in the relation to a particular social and cultural order. To be free, it must be possible for us to engage without surrendering, so that we can somehow be both insiders and outsiders at the same time. That is freedom. To be able to deny the last word to the social world and to keep the last word for ourselves. And then you could say, a similar contradiction arises in the relation of the self to itself. To be free, we must be able to form a coherent personality, a character. The Greeks said character is destiny, a way of being in the world. But we must not allow that way of being in the world to become the only and rigidified form of the self. We must be able to form this coherent way of being, but at the same time we must be able to disrupt it or to reinvent it, because otherwise it becomes a shell, a mummy within which we start to die. So there too, there's a contradiction. We have to have a coherent way of being, but we have to be able to resist it or to disrupt it from within. So that's an example of why this point of departure of the school philosophy is not the obvious way of thinking about ethics. Because one might think there's another way of thinking about ethics, in which really ethics is about the possession of life and the formation of personality in relation to these crucial contradictions of our freedom. Now let me go to the second step and say a few words about each of the three positions. So first, the utilitarian position, associated with Jeremy Bentham. Each of these three positions is associated unjustly with the name of a great philosopher. Consequentialism with Bentham, deontology with Kant, and social contract with Rousseau. I say unjustly because none of these three philosophers was a meta-ethicist in this sense. They weren't concerned with the conceptual contraction. They were concerned, all of them, with our ascent to a higher form of life. I can't resist saying that Jeremy Bentham himself revealed what he really thought in the dedication that he wrote in a book that he gave to a lady in London society. He said in that dedication, The best way to be happy is to make other people happy. The best way to make other people happy is to pretend to love them. And the best way to pretend to love them is to love them in fact. And in this way, he went in only 2 steps from utilitarianism to Christianity. So this was the real Bentham. But let's not deal with the real Bentham. Let's deal with this philosophy of consequentialism. So there are 2 moves that we have to make in order to make this idea of the greatest happiness of the greatest number usable. First, there's the question of whether the judgment of consequences applies act by act or to the whole system of rules. Rule utilitarianism versus act utilitarianism. And it is now more or less agreed that it must apply to the rules and not act by act. Because if we were to make the consequentialist judgments act by act, they're completely unstable, controversial, and obscure. So the consequentialist judgment has to be made about the order, not about just isolated episodes or acts. Now then comes the second question. In judging what is best, what is the greatest happiness for the greatest number, is the perspective of the agents themselves, of what is best for them? Or is there some independent judgment of what would truly make them happy and allow them to flourish? So if we say that the perspective is the perspective of the agents, then immediately the problem is, what is the institutional arrangements by which we aggregate their preferences? And there are 2 such sets of arrangements that are obvious candidates for that role. One is the market, and the other is democratic politics, democracy. The trouble is that every actual institutional manifestation of this aggregation is flawed and contestable. There is no agreement about which market. So there is no single natural and necessary form of the market order. In principle, a market order could be organized in radically different ways. And the same holds for democracy. Now, suppose we say, no, it's not just their individual perspective of happiness. There's some independent standard. So let me give you an example of a way of thinking about the independent standard. You say, we have 2 great sets of interests. We have material interests in the development of our practical powers, to lift the burden of poverty, infirmity, and drudgery that weighs on human existence, our empowerment. And then we have a moral interest in diminishing the coercive force of an entrenched system of social division and hierarchy on human life. So the liberals and socialists of the 19th century used to think that the institutional conditions for the advancement of these 2 sets of goods, the material goods and the moral goods, were the same. And we no longer believe that. We don't believe that there's a pre-established harmony and automatic convergence between the institutional conditions for the advancement of our material and moral interests. And we risk falling into the opposite, pessimistic dogma, that there's a tragic contradiction between them. But we might take another position, an experimental, skeptical position, and say, there is some possible zone of intersection between the institutional conditions for the development of our material powers and the institutional conditions for the development of our moral interests. And it's in that zone of intersection that we should travel. We should discover which are the institutions that would allow us to do both things. And one characteristic of those institutions, for example, might be that they would lend themselves to revision, that they would facilitate their own transformation in the light of experience. Now, I tried to give this example with some detail, just to suggest that it's quite obvious that the whole weight of the discussion in this case falls on the particulars of the claim. In other words, the felicific calculus, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, is not doing any work. Whatever work is being done by this particular social theoretical thesis. And we come again to the problem of institutions. We come to it at a second remove, because the question will be, what are the institutions that are in this zone of intersection? Whereas in the agent perspective that I've mentioned before, we come to it right away. The market or the democracy that aggregate individual preferences. All right, so now let's take the second position, Kantianism. Will only what you could will to be a universal rule. Now, the central problem, which the critics of Kant were aware of from the very beginning, is how you can deduce content from pure form, how the form of a universal maxim can generate content. And in order to illustrate what the problem is, let me analogize this idea, this deontological principle, to the Marxist conception of ideology. So, what is ideology in Marxism? A dominant class has certain interests, and it has to represent those interests as the interests of all of society in order for its view to become what Marx calls an ideology. But this transformation of the particular interest or of the class interest into a claim of universal interest is only possible, according to Marx, if in this transformation it's not just a rhetorical manipulation. That is, the universalizability has to have practical consequences for the restraint of class interests. Otherwise, it doesn't function as an ideology. Now, what's the point that I'm trying to make here? The point is that there is some substance in the Marxist conception of ideology. The substance is the interest of the dominant class. And the substance is then being contained through this universalization. What's the equivalent in the categorical imperative, in the Kantian principle? Kant says our natural desires as incarnate dying organisms have no moral weight whatsoever. They're just contingent accidents. They have no normative significance. That would be the equivalent in the Kantian position to the class interest in the Marxist idea of ideology. It's missing. There's no content. And somehow we have to get the content from just the form. And that seems to be impossible. Now take the third position, the social contract position. The essence of the social contract position is to imagine an idealized situation of choice. The veil of ignorance, as John Rawls called it, behind which we would have to choose principles without knowing what our position in the social division of labor would be, or knowing anything in particular about ourselves. So then it seems that there are two problems, and you can understand this problem from the point of departure or from the point of arrival. From the point of departure, the problem is that it seems you can't get anything out of the original position, out of the idealized situation of choice, unless you've already put something there into it. That is, the more vacuous the definition of the idealized situation of choice, the harder it will be to infer anything from it. If you infer something from it, you can really only infer something from it if you put it in there in the first place. You can't get it out of nothing. Now, you can also see this as a problem with respect to the point of arrival. So what is the point of arrival of this contractarian theory? You formulate universal principles, and these principles are neutral. They are impartial with respect to every particular contestable vision of the human good. This is the crucial idea in liberal political theory, the distinction between the impersonal right, the neutral right, and the sectarian good. And there must be an order that is neutral with respect to all possible visions of the good. And what is the problem? The problem is that no institutional order is neutral with respect to particular visions of the good. And the claim of neutrality that is adduced in defense of a particular order, in fact, always functions to entrench it and produce the opposite effect. That is, by claiming that the order is neutral, we insulate it from criticism and attack. And we prevent it from becoming more neutral. But this idea of neutrality is not completely false. It has a kinship to a legitimate idea. And the legitimate idea is that a form of social life should be open to a wide range of contradictory experience, of contradictory visions of the good, and above all, it should be corrigible. It should be open to attack. So the combination of openness to contradiction and corrigibility is the legitimate equivalent to the false idea of neutrality. So that's the criticism of the social contract position in this way. So there you have a few remarks about the three positions. And let me first stop and ask whether someone has a comment to make or a question. Otherwise yes.
So in the first part of your exposition, you were talking about the self.
Yes.
Can you clarify to us what exactly you mean by self when you mean the psychology of individual, humanness of the spirit of self?
No, I was really not developing an articulated moral position. I was just saying it's not obvious that this is the point of departure of ethics. There's a different way of thinking about it. And one way of thinking about it is, how do we become more alive? What are the conditions of vitality, of self-assertion, of the construction of personality? And everything follows from that. So it's not this book of accounts, right, which is the perspective of the meta-ethics. So now comes the Parfit thesis, which is the thesis that the three positions, the consequentialist, the deontological, and the social contract, are ascending the same mountain from different sides. And it's the same mountain. And the fundamental thesis is that if they all think alike, they must be the same. That is, they must be true. Because they wouldn't be all agreeing unless they were agreeing on what's right. Now, the first thing to notice about this thesis is its strange provincialism from the standpoint of the universal history of moral ideas. Because in this course, we're going to be examining Confucianism, Buddhism, radically different views of human life and human possibility. But right away, what has to be observed is the the strange difference between the universalistic altruism that permeates this philosophy and the teachings of Christianity. After all, it arose within a Christian civilization, and it was, in some sense, according to many of its students, a secularization of Christian ideas. But there's a fundamental difference between the Christian idea that the organizing principle of the moral life is love, and this emphasis on altruism as the organizing principle of the moral life. What's the difference between altruism and love? So, first, in altruism, the perspective is that the fundamental problem of our relations to one another is our self-centeredness and our self-interest. And that's what has to be tamed. As opposed to the idea that the fundamental problem is our reconciliation with one another. So, altruism implies sacrifice from above or from a distance. It is a sacrificial generosity, subjecting the interest of the self so the self doesn't count any more than the other selves. In love, there's no such distance. And the central problem in love is not our generosity toward the other. The central problem is the ability to recognize the other as enhancing my being rather than taking away from it. That first contradiction that I mentioned. That I can connect without losing any personal distinction or autonomy. So in altruism, there's no epistemological problem. There's no problem of imagining the other person. In love, there is a threshold, an imaginative threshold that has to be crossed at the outset. The initial problem is the imagination of the other. And that's prior to any question of sacrifice. And in altruism, there may be great sacrifice, even of one's own life. One gives one's life for the other. But there's no intimate jeopardy. There's no heightened vulnerability. Love requires a heightening of vulnerability. And this jeopardy, this intimate jeopardy. So it's completely different. So, Parfit says these three positions are equivalent. Now, and because they're equivalent, they must be true. Now, the first criticism is this critique of provincialism. But what are the alternative interpretations of the reality with which Parfit is dealing? So one interpretation it would be the three positions are equivalent because they're all empty. They're all indeterminate. That's why they're equivalent. I think that goes too far because they're not completely empty. They're indeterminate, they're manipulable, but they're not completely empty. So then the other thesis is the three positions are equivalent because they articulate different versions of the same fundamental approach to the moral life. And what are the common elements of this approach? So the first element is the idea that the central problem of morality is the problem of our selfishness or self-centeredness. That's what has to be tamed. The second common element is an idea of impartiality. The response to this self-centeredness is to create an impersonal, a neutral order. It's this, and the universalistic altruism is animating that. The third common element in these three positions is that the focus of the neutral order is the definition of our obligations to one another. So, it's as I said in the first class, it's a book of accounts. And the objective, as it were, is to get to the end of our lives showing that we're blameless, we're righteous. We'll be able to raise our hands in the front pews of the church and say, don't blame me. So it's a kind of morality that begins and ends in hand washing. It's sort of one might say unkindly, that it's the ethic of Pontius Pilate. The fourth common element in these positions is that they focus on a method, the philosophic calculus, the categorical imperative, or the idealized situation of choice, which will specify these obligations. So that's why they're meta-ethical positions. And the fifth common element is that because the method is indeterminate in its operation, it always has to have some institutional proxy. So there has to be some institutional arrangement that will represent the workings of the method in practice. And again, the two obvious candidates are the market and democracy. And so, for example, the social contract theory, the theories of justice that are promoted in the Anglo-American Academy are really philosophical or pseudo-philosophical attempts to justify the practices of corrective redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy. So they arose in these against the background of the social liberal or social democratic compromise of the late 20th century, in which the idea is we can't change the market order. The market is what it is. It generates inequalities, and we have to correct the inequalities after the fact through progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. So this is a philosophical prop, a quasi-metaphysical prop to that political idea. There's an egalitarian tone to the philosophy. It's an egalitarian profession of faith. But when the egalitarian tone is combined, is summed up with the institutional conservatism, the consequence of the summing up is to reduce the egalitarianism to the justification of corrective and retrospective redistribution through taxation or redistributive social entitlements. So that's, I would say, that's the salvageable element in the mystical shell of the Parfit thesis. They are equivalent, in a sense, these positions. But they are equivalent because they converge on those elements that I just enumerated. Now, finally, let me make one last set of suggestions about the historical background of these ideas. Their background in the actual history of society, not in the history of philosophy. It seems to me that these ideas are the description of the early modern European world. And in order to explain what I mean, let me recall the remark that Schopenhauer makes early in his masterwork, The World as Will and Representation, about our relations to one another. So he says, what are we like? We're like porcupines in the dark night who come closer together in order to warm one another. And when they come closer together, they prick each other with their spines. And then they go further apart. And so they keep going closer and further apart. When they go further apart, they become cold. When they come closer together, they hurt each other. And until they finally settle into an uncomfortable middle distance. So this moral theory and the politics with which it's associated are the moral theory and the politics of this middle distance of the porcupines. So, for example, the classic theory of contract and a property. Contract, the dominant contractual form, is not the relational ongoing contract, incompletely defined agreement. It's what the lawyers call a bilateral executory promise. It's an arm's length, fully articulated deal among strangers that will be completely exhausted in an instantaneous moment of performance at some time in the future. The classical conception of property, the unified property right, is I'm the master in my zone of property. When I'm acting in the zone of property, the interests of the others count for nothing. But as soon as I step one step beyond that zone, I lose all claims. So I'm either in the zone of entitlement or I'm totally vulnerable. So this is the world of the middle distance, without property, without contract. And what is its political manifestation? Its political manifestation is the proto-democratic liberalism, in which politics is cold and institutional. It creates this universal form, which claims to be neutral. There's no struggle over the basic terms of social life. And we don't imagine that politics can be both hot and institutional. And finally, there's a theological or religious basis for this middle distance, which is the basis of what you could call the middle part of the history of Protestantism. That is, religion is made private, it's privatized. Faith is rendered internal to the individual, and Protestantism wasn't like that at the beginning with Luther and Calvin, and it's not like that today. But it was like that in the 18th and 19th century. And these three theories and their philosophers, Bentham, Kant, and Rousseau, emerge against that background of this privatized form of Christianity. So I think that's the world that this philosophy comes from. And it's a vanished world. Maybe it never existed, but it certainly doesn't exist now. And so it's the baggage of that world. It's a legacy of that world, this world of the middle distance. And that's how we should understand it. So I've concluded my disquisition in my 4 steps. And I'm open to your interrogation. Michael, would you like to begin maybe with any comment about this?
Oh, let's open up first.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, well, let's open up first and then
Sure.
I'll come back later. Absolutely, please. Sit here. Yes, please.
Yeah, so there's one tension that I see that I want you to maybe clarify. So you mentioned that there's this universal feature of self-centeredness, sort of a Machiavellian feature that we have. And then
No, wait a minute, I lost you there. Say that again.
so we have this innate human selfishness, right? Like we're sort of self-interested, self-centered, selfish, something that we started off with. Right?
As an assumption of this philosophy, of this school philosophy, yes. It's not what I'm saying, it's what they're saying.
Okay, that's what I But then we have these three theories that essentially tell us that hypothetically, this is how we should go about living.
Yes.
Right? The problem that I see is that isn't that sort of loss of use because I know the world is going to be a certain way, and these theories don't seem pragmatic in that sense.
Well, but the theories are all attempts to tame the self-centeredness. You associated yourself with this thesis that the essential problem in moral experiences are selfishness. So the theories appear on the scene armed with this idea that they will create a world in which the ego will not be allowed to treat itself as the center of experience. You'll be just one among many. There'll be this impartial order. And these are three versions of how you get to that impartial order. Yes?
But that's not going to happen, right? That's not going to happen. That's never going to happen, in my opinion. So if I keep trying to push these three ways of being, I'm losing at the end of the day because people will be evil.
Well, I think their answer is it will happen. Imperfectly, but it will happen. And it will happen in both politics and in morals. So in politics, we will establish a liberal state with an impersonal order of right that will be neutral among different conceptions of the good. That will be the basis of law. That's how we will do it politically. And then in morals, we will attempt through the philosophic calculus or the categorical imperative or the social contract principles to orient our conduct in a way that masters our selfishness. That's the theory. And it's a pedagogy of both political and moral transformation that its defenders would say is relatively effective. It doesn't make us into angels. As Kant said, nothing straight was ever made out of the crooked timber of humanity, but it improves our situation. That's the claim. It has very limited, I think one of the most obvious things to say about this philosophy is that it has very limited hopes. So you seem to be even less hopeful than they are. But they're not very hopeful. They say, we're not going to ascend to a higher level of experience, but at least we can be something other than bandits in our relations to one another. That's their idea. My heart will be impure, but my hands will be clean.
And just to quickly underline
Yes.
this as well.
Yes.
So they're of course not saying we should be non-selfish creatures. So to give a typical example from the way the social contractualist arguments work, the common move, as Professor Unger was saying, was to say, okay, let's imagine in the state of nature, everyone is simply purely selfish and grabbing everything for themselves and therefore killing everyone else in the process. But the result is everyone dies quickly, so they don't really get to actually accomplish anything or even get goods for themselves because they'll soon be dead. So then they come together and decide that, exactly as Professor Unger said, if together they come up with a good contract about how they can live together, then things will be okay. But getting back to the heart of this, it's not that they're not selfish, it's that they are restricting it to rational self-interest. So I will be rationally self-interested, and therefore I will accept, as Professor Unger said, that I get my own property, that will be mine, I will be sovereign over it, but then I have to accept that my neighbor has that property and I can't just go and grab it. And so I'm still a completely self-interested creature in this model, but it's simply I'm accepting restrictions on what I can grab for myself with the claim that in the long run, therefore, I get more because I can't grab my neighbor's stuff, but at least I have my own sovereign property. So they're not asking us to be non-selfish. They're simply saying, have what they will call a rational self-interest that in the long run they claim will get us more. And as we will see throughout this course, we'll be dealing with thinkers who will say that is a woefully inadequate way to think about humanity and to think of what we're capable of. But getting back to the heart of the question, they still, in this way of thinking, they want us to be selfish. They just want to restrict it to proper rational self-interest.
Yes.
You mentioned that all these philosophies bear the mark of order that you claim has vanished, and in a certain way they have become outdated and they need to be replaced. That's the way I understand at least what you mean. But I'm not sure if they're that outdated, because to me, many of the economic, social presuppositions that are behind these doctrines are in place. We don't have right now an alternative to a market economy. Last time we tried this a few decades ago, it was a disaster. We don't really have an alternative to liberal democracy. So it just seems to me that as of now, at this historical juncture, there is really nothing. We have to be in this middle
Yeah.
way that the philosophies are working through.
Well, this is a very large argument, which we're not going to be able to have here in this course about the institutional alternatives. But what I would say is the problem is not the market versus something else. The problem is which market. So the market order has no single natural and necessary form. Can be organized in different ways. Now, the thesis of fundamentalist economics, like for example Hayek's economics, is that there is a spontaneous order that converges automatically to a single legal and institutional structure. So if Robinson Crusoe traded on his island long enough, he would eventually reproduce the whole system of 19th century German private law. That was the thesis. I think this thesis is absurd, and the jurists know it's absurd. A market order can be established on completely different. The same thing with respect to democracy. So we have a certain all the democracies that exist in the world are relatively weak democracies. They're flawed. One of the ways in which they're flawed is that they continue to make change depend on crisis. So we need a different market, we need a different democracy. Then we become interested in a form of thought that is about institutional transformation. That's in politics. As opposed to this idea that the existing form is the basis, is the proxy for a neutral order. It's not neutral. It's obviously not neutral. And the claim of neutrality is being adduced in favor of the opposite. That is, it's helping to entrench the existing flawed forms against attack and against transformation. That's the claim. Now that's on the political side, because we're not actually dealing here in this course with the political side. We're dealing with the moral side. And there's this complicated relation between politics and morals, because politics happens in historical time. These projects of institutional transformation don't succeed or fail in the time scale of a human life. They happen only in historical time. So one of the things that we have to do in our moral ideas is we have to make up for the failures of politics. As given that we live in this imperfect world, what do we do in our relations to one another to make up for the fact that we failed to transform society in such and such a way? Now, and that gets us back to this previous question comment that was made. So there's a very limited level of transformative hope. So I suppose most of the politics of this ethics would I suppose, agree with what you just suggested at the beginning of your remark. This is the best we can hope for politically. It's not going to be better than this. It's this market or no market. It's this democracy or no democracy. And that then closes down the funnel. Yes?
Hi, Professor. So, listening to Professor Mangabeira's speech, what comes to mind is that it seems that later thinkers are sort of perhaps intending or not intending, but they are carrying.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Okay.
Because we're all masked, so that makes things harder.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, would it be fair to say that later authors seem to be almost subconsciously characterizing earlier authors in ways that are increasingly less radical and transformative? And I'll give an example to make this less abstract. For example, when we talk about when we talk about the idea, in Kant or Hegel or other one of those Enlightenment thinkers, of sort of a kind of transcendence through social living, we are, they're sort of characterizing the Christian salvation by faith that worketh through charity, as it states in the Bible, or in an even crazier example that is almost sort of dreamlike. What if it were, for example, the Schopenhauer example? It seems almost like this reformulation, an imagetic reformulation of Buddhist ethics, or rather Buddhist doctrine. And this may seem strange, but I explain. So, we're porcupines, and we come closer to each other, and we prick each other. So in attraction, you create aversion and suffering. But when you move further apart, this aversion sort of creates attraction again. And then, really the solution is to find a middle way, middle path.
Well, in Buddhism, actually, the solution is to overcome the self and the will and to become selfless. And in Schopenhauer, in that description of the porcupines, Schopenhauer is speaking about the middle distance into which we fall. So I use that in my argument just to say that this morals, this ethic, is the ethic of the middle distance. So is that the best we can hope for? That's the crucial question. What is the ascent for which we can hope? To what can we ascend in our relations to one another? And certainly, I think this universalistic altruism is, to my mind, not Christian. It's pagan. And there's a fundamental difference between the perspective of altruism and the perspective of love. So that its relation to Christianity, as I said, is a troubled relation, although it's often represented as a pietistic secularization of Christian moral ideas. Yes?
I guess I'm curious, to what extent these theories depend on holding freedom as like the highest or one of the highest goods, and even this uneasy middle ground, it seems like it's sort of trying to want to be both free and live in society. And I know we talk about Eastern cultures as like a critique of freedom as the highest good, but even in the West, and even before the Protestant Reformation, that wasn't necessarily the case with like Catholicism, for example. So yeah, could it be a valid critique to say that freedom isn't the highest good or shouldn't be the highest good, and build our societies around that and allow ourselves to be pricked for the sake of something greater?
So, are you referring to the part of my argument in which I gave that example of a different perspective, like those contradictory relations, the self to others, the self to society, the self to itself? And I said, we're not free to the extent that we don't resolve those contradictions. That's freedom in a very large sense, freedom in the sense of vitality, of the possession of life. How do we become alive? How do we come to life? If we have to choose between engaging in society and surrendering, or being marginalized and annulled, we're not free. But we're not free in a very large sense of freedom. We haven't come into the possession of life in the present moment. So that was the way of thinking that I was pointing to in that part of my remark. Not a conception of freedom that is, for example, like the liberal conception of freedom in liberal political theory, but a conception of vitality, of the enhancement of life. And in a sense, this too is Christianity, because Christianity is how do we come to life and an eternal life. But what are the attributes of life? So it's just a different perspective from this perspective of obligations, of this book of accounts, in which we're trying to determine our credits and our debits to one another and settle the accounts before we die. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to take kind of the opposite position of my Machiavellian friend here and approach it in a different way, in the sense that it seems like a lot of this hinges on the premise that we talked about of human selfishness, right, or our tendency toward pursuing our own ends
Yes.
to the detriment of others, right? But I wonder, if we can challenge that assumption as well, right? Given that for most of human history we were in hunter-gatherer tribes, we worked cooperatively, there was very little violence compared to the scale that emerged after agriculture and so on. And even now, when you see what happens in the aftermath of disasters, there's so many instances of immediate cooperation and the emergence of mutual aid networks and all these sorts of things.
Yes.
So I wonder what you think of the idea that, what if it isn't the case that our ethics need to be based on the assumption that humans are inherently selfish and cruel and all those things?
I just think this is a radical foreshortening of the agenda of ethics. So I mentioned in the first class that the two moral visions that we will be mainly exploring in this course, the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity, and the ethic of connection and responsibility, are each of them associated with one of the major functional imperatives of the advanced societies. So the first is associated with the enhancement of personal agency. So this is one of the great ideals in the world today. How we can rise, we can ascend to a higher level. How do we become bigger? We only become bigger together. And we have to ascend. So the individual, to have the sense of agency, to be able to act in the world, has to be able to respond to his context rather than to take the context for granted, to change it as he goes along, to resist, to rebel. So that's one set of ideas. The second moral vision is associated with the other functional imperative, which is the development of higher forms of cooperation. The secret to worldly success, what makes a society flourish, is that its members can cooperate. And cooperation is beyond the simple contrast of self-interest and altruism. And then we have to ask ourselves, what are the characteristics of these higher forms of cooperation? So their institutional form is indeterminate. And we have to determine what they are. What's their political form? What's the economic form? And so forth. That's all a different world, rather than the world in which the only question is our selfishness and how to tame it. It's an impoverished view of ethics. I think that's the recurrent theme in today's discussion. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about something specific that you said when you were talking about altruism and love. And you said that in love you can connect without losing autonomy. And I mean, I don't disagree that love is a higher, practice than altruism, but isn't kind of the whole point of love is that there's a contradiction in which you do give up your
Isn't what the whole point?
that there's a contradiction in which you give up your autonomy because you can't love nothing, you have to love something, so love actually needs another object. So I guess I'm just kind of wondering how you square, maintaining autonomy while practicing love.
Well, so the question is, how can you connect without losing yourself? So we might think that part of the experience of love is the experience of a form of connection which adds to me rather than subtracting from me. So I can connect without any loss of distinction or without being subjugated. But that's not possible outside the sphere of intimacy, right? So altruism is capable of universal application. Love is not. Christ said, love your enemies, but it's confounding what that can mean, what love means outside the sphere of intimacy. So we have to imagine then some political proxy for love. And the general idea is cooperation. Cooperation among free and equal individuals is the political proxy for love. But it has no clear institutional form. So then we have this struggle over what should the form be, and so forth. And then we have a larger world of debates. That's how I'm thinking of it. Yes?
When you mentioned the privatized
Religion.
yeah, the privatized religion, what does I guess I have an idea of what the public Catholic religion look like, but what does the public Protestantism look like? Why did it become privatized?
Well, why does it become privatized? That's a very heavy question, right? With a lot of historical baggage. Generally, you could say in these societies, speaking about the modern West, that one of the movements characteristic of their culture is that the sublime has been privatized. So by the sublime, I mean art, religion, everything that is intense is rendered internal to the individual. Politics then becomes cold. Politics is about marginal advances in equity and efficiency. It's not about adventurism. Adventurism is internal to the self. And then they say, look at what happened in the 20th century when there were all these political romantics trying to transform the world. It was a disaster. The world was put on fire. So that's then the debate that begins. So religion can also be privatized in this way. So it becomes a subject for internal reflection. It has no political vision. It brings no hope for the transformation of society. That's not And this is contrary, I think, to the nature of religion, because in general, every religion tries to inform the whole of social life. No religion accepts that part of human experience can be cabined off and not touched by the religious vision. Everything will be touched. But there were nevertheless certain exceptions or contrary traditions in the history of religion, and specifically in the history of Christianity. So the individual begins to think of Christianity as his private religion, of private faith, internal to the self, having as its object his relations to other individuals, but having no larger significance for the transformation of society. That's an accident that happened in the history of Christianity at a certain moment. It's not a permanent characteristic of Christianity, as it isn't of any religion.
And what did the public Protestantism look like? Like you said, when it was Luther, that's not to say that's right.
So early Protestantism had a political vision. Calvin, for example, very definitely had a political vision. Modern day Protestantism and its theologians also have a social vision. So this is simply a throwaway remark that the middle period of the history of Protestantism, the 18th and 19th century, was a period in which there was this privatization of the religious vision and the separation of the public realm, politics and law, from private faith. And I think it's very hard to reconcile with Christianity, as it would be hard to reconcile with any religion. Religion is about everything. Now, people say, the people who are hostile to this vision of politics say, politics is no place to look for salvation. And what I would say in response is, if you're going to look for salvation anywhere, you have to look for salvation everywhere. And that's the perspective of the religions. Yes?
Going back to pessimism, because people don't actually start from the state of nature, I sort of have a hard time understanding why, even assuming that everybody's selfish like these philosophies do, a selfish person would be compelled by them if they already had any power. Like, why would a tyrant learning about these philosophies, assuming he's perfectly self-interested, ever step behind the veil of ignorance or contract to get something he could just take?
Because the view of these philosophies is that the perspective of altruism also comes naturally to us. That is, self-interest comes naturally, but then we discover early on that self-interest will lead to anarchy. And so we need an alternative to it, and the alternative to it is the altruistic perspective. And we're going to come to this in Confucianism also. The individual the individual as the child is broken on the wheel of the social order. So he gains a second nature. The second nature is the nature given to him by society and by culture, which teaches him to serve the others. And without that, there's nothing. There's anarchy. No society flourishes. So these theories are theories of our second nature. And they don't adapt, their pessimism is a qualified pessimism. So they don't tell us that we're condemned to be those bandits that we were when we were little infants. We can acquire the second nature. But on the other hand, they say, let's not hope for too much. Let's not hope that we can deeply and permanently transform the conditions of social life, arise to a higher form of life, and so forth. Now you're saying, why would anyone accept that view? That's the view that it seems that people generally accept. We can't hope for transformation. We can't hope to ascend for a higher form of life. But we can hope to acquit ourselves of our obligations to one another from the perspective of impartiality. That's their teaching. Now, is that good enough? Is that all we can hope for? That's the question raised by these philosophies. Yes?
Yeah, I just had a question, kind of a comment as well about the three traditions and their connection to Christianity. It seems to me, I agree completely about love and early Christianity, especially as taught by Christ. But very, very soon after that, the influence of St. Paul changed the Christian church, I think. And it seems to me that there is a lot more in common with that later form of Christianity and the three traditions than the early form as taught by Christ, especially the emphasis on love. I just want to see what you thought about that, Professor, if it's meaningful to draw that distinction, and if you think that the later form, which is the Christianity we've known for the longest, does actually have more in common with Kant and consequentialism and contract theory than the earlier form.
As opposed to the Pauline Christianity. So it's a very complicated question. It's a question about the history of Christianity, right? So I don't see any view of Christianity which could accept the idea that Christianity is the religion of altruism. Not Christianity before St. Paul, not Christianity after St. Paul. Christianity was never the religion of altruism. And if you think about it, altruism in a way is, although we think of it as a high moral conquest, it's dehumanizing. So, I mean, think of this. Think of it in its political context. So suppose you think that history has a script of progression, like Marxism, the Marxist script, and the individual should then sacrifice himself to this collective enterprise. And he should make himself an instrument of this historical progression. His life should be a means to that collective goal. That denatures us. So if we're going to throw ourselves into a political struggle, the political struggle can't just have this instrumental character of advancing a collective goal. It has to somehow communicate with something about us. So, for example, you might think there is an affinity between this. So the individual, as he grows older, forms this character, the rigidified form of the self, and the character becomes this mummy within which he begins to die, right? So he has an interest in disrupting this mummy in order to continue to live. If he then throws himself into the confusions and struggles of politics, the mummy is taken away, it's disrupted. So one of the reasons in which we might engage in a political struggle for more than instrumental reasons is we might think it serves my existential purpose of disrupting this mummy. And then we're not acting as if we were just ants, as servants of the collective good. So you could say there are two unacceptable ideas of the relation of the individual to politics. One is he's just the instrument, and he sacrifices himself at the altar. He gives his life to serve this collective project, which communicates with no intimate aspirations of his own. The other opposite idea is the romantic idea that politics is a form of private adventurism. And that's also bad, in which our ideological positions are simply pretexts for these romantic experiments. But in between those two positions, there's the idea that there can somehow be a resonance between our political faith and our own interest in our transformation. And that's a higher position. So that's actually an example of the way of thinking about, a way of thinking about ethics toward which we're reaching in this course. That it's not just about obligations. It's not about these debits and credits. It's about our transformative hopes for society and for ourselves. How much we can hope for, what is the path of our ascent, and so forth. And this is just a different way of thinking, to my mind, far superior.
Yeah, I agree. I think I was just focused on the centrality of sacrifice in Pauline Christianity. Like the crucifixion is made the event that kind of defines the religion, and we're all supposed to emulate Christ by sacrificing ourselves. It just seems very altruistic. It seems like.
Well, I think the altruistic interpretation of the idea of sacrifice is too impoverished. Sacrifice is not just altruism. Sacrifice is a form of transformation. It's a ritual act by which we transform ourselves and transform society. I think this is the significance of sacrifice. And sacrifice does not figure in the religion of the ants. It figures in the religion of the human beings. And it's about life, it's about coming to life, and about transformation. Are we finished?
I think we are, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. We will see you next week and very much look forward to these discussions. Thank you.
What did you think of that? I mean, these questions that they were asking at the end were unanswerable questions.
But they're trying to raise the unanswerable questions right at the beginning. The scene will be able to at least give them. So I got it over. Otherwise, I was afraid the discussion would all be about simply Parker. That would be a good 2 hours. So I think we immediately moved into the big unanswerable questions.
No, that's my gift to you.
Yes. Muito bem. Muito obrigado. Você vem de que lugar no Brasil?
Eu nasci em Belém.
Belém.
Absolutely.
Muito obrigado.
Yeah, no, I'm
Glad to meet you, yeah.
Yeah, I work for Professor Brewer.
Ah, excellent. Fantastic. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for taking me.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
How is the problem linking, I feel the course keeps going from sort of the context of life to a political perspective of how the society is organized. So I'm not sure if that's
As a de facto, my office hours are when I walk back from class. I teach Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So after class, any day. Yeah, you can just walk back with me or something. Yes. Yes.
How these philosophers tell us about it. So I was wondering if you have sort of any how to respond to it.
Which school of thought? You mean the school philosophy?
I'm now blanking on the name.
Perfect.
Yeah. How you would respond to sort of
You mean the academic moral philosophy represented by these three positions? Yes.
how would they respond to post-structuralist thinking that would suggest, I guess, that like the search for a universal ethical framework
That comes from a different world. Huh? So they don't respond to it is the simple answer. All these variations of academic thought are ingrown, they talk to themselves, and they invoke the names of these great philosophers, but as I said in today's discussion, the great philosophers have almost nothing to do with this. This is a professorial philosophy, and it's mainly concerned with these conceptual contraptions that are designed to specify obligations. So, what you're calling post-structuralism or structuralism has very little normative content to start with, so that there's no direct joinder of issues. Moral vision. So I don't know how to answer your question because
ethics are always within historical and social context, and therefore, what is right and good, and what is good.
no, but that can easily devolve into a kind of moral relativism. Huh?
That's the opposite.
So, yeah, but so the question is,